Hi there, and welcome to Climbing Consulting with me, your host, Nick Sinnott. Today, we have another first for the podcast. It's the first round 2 interview. In this episode, I have Dom Moorhouse back on the show to talk about the importance of high-performing teams and answer the questions you've been dying to ask him. If you've listened to his first interview, you'll know that he credits much of his success with being exposed to and then developing high-performing teams. In our first interview, we covered a huge amount of ground, but we didn't get a chance to cover this specific topic. So I invited Dom back on the show to talk about why high-performing teams are so important and how you can develop one in your business, practice area, or project team. In today's episode, we go into detail on why high-performing teams are critical to your business success. We discuss the academic research that Dom conducted that proves this out, as well as how you can develop your own high-performing team utilizing Dom's team to tribe model. Following this, we pick up on some of the questions that you sent in for Dom to answer, including Dom's advice to his 30-year-old self, which may not be quite what you expected, and what Dom's morning routine looks like, among other great questions. It was really good to catch up with Dom again, and I hope you enjoy this as much as our first conversation. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Dom Moorhouse. Hi, Dom, and welcome back to the podcast. Great to have you back on the show.
Yeah, great to see you back, Nick. You haven't brought the weather this time, though. So, yeah.
No, you would have thought
broken
later in the year, but yeah, we're so back here at Dom's house, and it's not quite as sunny outside, but I'm sure it will be as good an interview as the last one. So we're back here because one of the things that we mentioned a few times, or you mentioned a few times during the last catch up, was around high performing teams, and it's something that's obviously been critical to your success and how you built Moorhouse and some of the things you're doing now. But we ran out of time last time to actually talk about it. So Dom very kindly agreed to a round 2 where we are today going to delve into high performing teams and Dom's work on developing that at Moorhouse and Dom's research on that. And I won't say too much more on that. I'll let Dom take that. But firstly, what have you been up to? It's been a few months since I last saw you. I know Method Grid was going well, was in a free beta. How are things there?
Well, thanks for asking, Nick. So I think when you came here last time, that was a sort of, still fair to say, a bit of a side of the desk project, as you would say. And in the last few months, it's definitely taken a step forward. So, effectively, when we last spoke, it was, I guess, still in the public beta phase. We were still essentially validating whether there was a product there that, we could take to market. And the update would be to say, we've been hugely pleased with how it's gone. And, we now have over 250 accounts, organizations on the product, getting very positive feedback. So we've actually been working hard in recent weeks to develop and turn on the paywall. So I think if this podcast is going out shortly, it will actually be behind a paywall, and we are going into a concerted effort to market the product further and get it out there.
Brilliant. Well, great to hear that it's been going so well, and you're taking that step into putting the paywall up and taking it from, like you say, a sort of side of desk into the next phase. I mean, if people didn't have a chance and missed out on getting signed up, because I think you offered a year free if they signed up before the paywall went up, but if people are listening, why should they go on it?
Yeah, no, actually, and thank you, because I probably haven't remotely explained what it is. So Method Grid, and we touched on it, I think, very briefly, didn't we, in our last chat, was essentially, it came out of the fact that, from many conversations I've had with specifically professional service leaders, one key component of value is the sort of systematic capturing, structuring of methodology and intellectual property. And it's such a key component. And why is that? Well, firstly, it ensures you're standardizing your delivery. Jane is sort of working similarly to John. And, that means a huge amount in terms of the client's value of your business. Consistency is a really, really key aspect. That also means you can be much more structured about your own internal professional development. It helps join up people from a knowledge management perspective as well. So that was a key logic into the design of Method Grid, is that at a granular level, you could essentially tag expertise across the platform. And, if you don't have the answer, or you're not an expert in a particular area, you always know which colleague, who is. And then another key aspect, which was really, from my own experience at Moorhouse was key, was it helps you win work. If you're a small specialist boutique player, you're always going to get the big guys saying, oh, that's a competitive area to us. And to a degree, it's difficult to explain to prospect clients that, you have that genuine specialism and often above where a general multi-provider player is going to be. Demonstrating it via deep toolboxes and methodology sets is the way you do that. And it was absolutely key to how we won a lot of work at Moorhouse, because as soon as we opened up our toolbox, essentially a prospect was looking at, in our instance, something that would spend many, many years, building. And on the other hand, you'd be lucky if you had one or two slide decks. So being able to demonstrate them, and have that deep toolbox is so key to winning work. So for all of those key reasons, having sort of structured in IP is key. But what I sort of realized is there isn't really a platform out there that helps, particularly a sort of SME player, capture that. You spend a lot of time developing the interface. So, I guess that was the starting hypothesis. Could we build a platform that really enables? Method Grid was over a couple of years now of development, a number of iterations, and a brilliant beta community has got to a place we're really super excited by. Yeah, and it goes to market as we speak.
Brilliant. And like you say, it's obviously key, that knowledge management side and showing the depth of your knowledge and what you can bring, vital at Moorhouse, and great to hear that others are leveraging that through Method Grid. And just the last piece, because we've not touched on it, if someone wants to go and have a look, have you decided on the paywall? How much am I paying if I'm an SME and want to go and use it?
So you find it at methodgrid.com, and we'll go out on multiple currencies. And I guess UK and US prices, UK prices roughly, we're looking at sort of an £8.50 per user per month price point. So I guess circa $10 per user per month. We've tested that, we've surveyed that. That feels like it's down the lower end of the SaaS kind of product range typically. But for us, the Method Grid really works when you have everybody on the platform, and essentially you're tagging everybody's expertise across an organization, across a team. So we wanted to go down to the lower end of that spectrum, and we'll see how that works as we head off into the next phase.
Brilliant. Well, I'll include the link to the website in the show notes if you want to go and check it out. As Dom said, methodgrid.com. And I look forward to, I'm sure we'll catch up again soon, and look forward to hearing how that goes. So bringing us back to sort of the core element for today, why don't we start with actually what is a high-performing team for you? We talked about high-performing teams being critical in the last episode. I think why don't we just start there with what is a high-performance team and why is it so important?
In terms of what it is, I'm going to actually defer the answer to that question, Nick, because I think actually, what I want to try and do is get beyond the sort of fairly, the sort of glib one-line summaries. And actually, it does need a sort of degree of unpacking to fully define that. And I think actually what we'll do through this conversation is we'll explore the different, dimensions and layers to that. So hopefully, certainly by the end of this conversation, that will become clearer. The why it's important, again, deserves, I guess, a little bit of layering, because, at one end, it's sort of the bleeding obvious. And to try and get beyond that, I would say, well, it's in some ways, I kind of tell you my own personal journey was coming out of Moorhouse and just assuming, I guess, that most people ran organizations in the way that Moorhouse ran itself. And it was only by dint of, I guess, meeting a load of other businesses over the years after, and clearly primarily in the sort of professional services world, and getting privileged access into a lot of those organizations, that I really, really was struck by the fact that you're invariably talking to very, very, bright, driven, intelligent leaders. And invariably there's a pretty sound plan, stratagem in place. But what became increasingly clear to me was that the real decider as to whether that was an organization that was going to just bob along fairly mediocre kind of path, or whether it was genuinely a growing, scaling business, was whether there was a high-performing team in place that could execute those plans. And I think I needed to see that almost myself, and also sort of note the fact that it was by almost rare exception that it was a growing, scaling business. And when you got under the hood of those businesses, again, it wasn't because they had a genius stratagem that was kind of uniquely different. It was they just had a completely different quality of teamship. And it reinforced clearly something that I felt was a fairly intuitive starting hypothesis. But that for me is why it's so key to business fundamentally, because you can't prosecute plans otherwise. I mean, if you were to get a little bit more forensic, I think you might say the professional services space, it is all about people. And if you boil that question down, what is a business leader seeking to do? Well, fundamentally, to maximize the performance of their team and their employees. And what does that mean? Well, employee performance is probably made up of a number of aspects. I mean, as economists would say, human capital, experience and education and skill sets and so forth. Clearly traits, and people carry different traits. but fundamentally motivation. And for me, and I'm sort of jumping ahead of myself a little bit because it's what the research goes into, but if you can improve inherent levels of motivation, you're going to massively improve levels of employee performance, and you're going to massively therefore improve the effectiveness of your business. So get into the nub of what motivates people to work, as I'm about to come on to, lives or dies on whether you perceive and actually are in a high performing team.
And you've teed it up nicely, and maybe I should have started there. Is this isn't just a soundbite that you like to say, you should have a high performing team. You've done quite an in-depth piece of research on this, and maybe why don't we start with the background to that research, what led to you doing it, and then, as you say, we can talk about some of those components that builds to the sort of finale of the high performing team.
No, sure. So I may have touched on this, Nick, when we spoke last time, but by, to be honest, more serendipity, I kind of ended up on an Open University second degree in my latter years, which was evolved into a PPE degree. So I started off, I just loved philosophy, did some philosophy modules, realized that I could, stay on the track, and found myself concluding a PPE degree last year. Well, the final module was an economics module, and the final aspect of that module was a self-directed project and some fairly dry, economic areas. And I managed to convince my tutor that I really wanted to do that piece of research into this aspect of what genuinely motivates people to work, something I'm really interested in, and particularly a hypothesis I have that the explanatory component of membership of a high-performing team goes way beyond most neoclassical or even modern behaviorist theories as to what drives that. Took some convincing, but I successfully managed to convince him that it would certainly light my passion if I could put it on that topic. And so that was the sort of starting point. And then the research is picking up this point really, which is real fascination with what motivates people to work. And there's certainly a lot of neoclassical economic theory out there, and fundamentally, historically, you pay people more, they work harder, would be the simplification of it. Of course, with modern sort of more behaviorist theories, that's softened, and people understand a lot more now about the sort of intrinsic sides of motivation. And so what I set out to do, and you'll have to kind of listener warning, really, I'm going to say something that will then deserve a little bit of explanation, but was what's called a least squares statistical regression on an econometric model. So there you go. That's the soundbite for this podcast. So essentially what that was seeking to do was to build a model that could potentially explain what motivates people at work. And I mean, essentially, statistical regression, all you're seeking to do is to understand the strength of an explanatory relationship and whether, statistically it stands up, whether there's actually a genuine relationship there or not. So what I needed to do was to have enough data to have, to be able to do that. I needed to get a lot. And partly my tutor was quite concerned actually that I was going to set off and fall over. But I was really lucky. I guess, using my own network, I managed to get just shy of 400 returns to a fairly complex questionnaire. And that was largely US and UK. And it was largely, again, by dint of my network, it was largely in the professional services, primary sector space. So I think that's quite an important caveat up front. But the model that I sought to explore and a starting hypothesis is, okay, so on one hand, on one side, it's called the sort of dependent variable, and I labeled it E, is effort and motivation. It's such an important component of ultimately, performance and therefore business success.
And just to be clear, that's employees. So how motivated am I and how much effort am I going to put into your thing?
Yes, absolutely. And unsurprisingly, it's also completely correlate with how long am I likely to be around in this organization as well. It was completely correlate. So that was E. And if you like, that's on the left-hand side of the equation. That's the dependent variables. So then I put up a starting hypothesis, at least to test the strength of the relationships, explanatory relationships to that. And I put up initially 4. And if you can look at this both as extrinsic and intrinsic factors and fixed and contingent factors. So if you take extrinsic fixed, broadly anyway, wages, and that's clearly taking classical, neoclassical economics. And I labeled that one W. The next one was extrinsic but contingent. So to a degree, some elements of bonus would be that performance bonus, but also a whole load of other aspects that are contingent on your situations. So, whether you're getting great holidays and health benefits and great training, et cetera, et cetera. And that was X in the formula. And then the next one is intrinsic. And intrinsic fixed is just, how inherently motivated are you as an individual? It doesn't matter where you are or what you're doing or what team you're in, what organization you work for. Just, you as Nick, what's your intrinsic level of motivation? Call that one Y. And then the final one, which was the area I was super interested in, is membership of a high-performing team. I labeled that Z. And then clearly what I did do was I was consistent in how each was measured so I could understand the relative import of each across that set. And Z was made up with a whole load. Well, they all were essentially made up of a whole load of derivative questions. And Z particularly, I'd built a model, I call it the team to tribe model, which in some ways the questionee might not have even understood that they were talking about a team. It just, came at it from a number of questions, but ultimately it kind of produced for me, what is a very good summary team score. So that was the input hypothesis, and essentially, grabbed all of those questionnaires and fed them back in to the statistical sort of processor, if you like. And the first really super fascinating result was that essentially W and X, if you remember, wages and extrinsic benefits, and could be effectively kicked out. They had no explanatory contribution to make to what motivates people. And I should say here actually that there was complete normal distribution in the sort of effort levels. There were people that are down at a 1, 2, and 3. This wasn't just talking to a super motivated set. It was just, effectively normally distributed. It was across pretty much all ages of the workplace. It was gender neutral, and it just kicked out. It just, from a statistical perspective, nothing to contribute. And I kind of my hunch was it would certainly be weak relative to other aspects. I was really struck by the fact it had genuinely no statistical correlate.
Just for my listeners' benefit, you might hear that and think suddenly, well, why are consultants getting paid as much as they are? Was there any minimum threshold to that? So is it that after a certain level, that variable disappears, or did it just not matter at all?
No, it's a great question. So a really intelligent corollary question to that is, well, where's W and X gone? Because clearly they have a role to play when you're hiring people. Yeah? So if you go back to where I started it and saying the obsession about employee performance, and it's broadly made up of human capital, personal traits, and motivation, almost additive. If you want to bring in people to your organization with the requisite levels of human capital and the requisite levels of the positive traits you seek, you essentially have to pay fair market price. All that this is saying is once somebody's crossed the gate and they're in your team, in relative to motivation, wages and bonuses actually have very little to say. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So actually, it wasn't part of your research, but during the recruitment conversation, 5, 10 grand, whatever it was, might have some bearing. But once you're in, the suggestion that work harder for a 10 grand pay rise might not.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And I think, fundamentally, in terms of that starting conversation about, almost refereeing people into the firm, it's got to be perceived as a fair trade at that point. If it isn't perceived as fair, then I think that will start to sort of unwind down the line. But as long as you've paid fair remuneration for the kind of talent and the human capital that you seek, the conversation about motivation and effort down the line is moved way beyond remuneration. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so going back to, I guess, this iteration here, W and X have been kicked out. And I then spent essentially days playing, and you are sort of tweaking and iterating a model to try and understand, well, what is the best explanation for E? I've collected a load of questions. I've still got, in this instance, Y and Z left. But is there anything else I asked that can fill a hole in it, and different forms of the equation? And essentially just, it's almost a creative exercise at this point, just looked at multiple different explanations. And eventually landed on one which was really striking when I got there. It was a really powerful explanation of E. In statistics sort of parlance, it's called an R squared of a model, is the degree to which the independent variable is explained the dependent variable, and it had a really, really high R squared, particularly so for what is essentially a behavioral, non-physical kind of world. And it came down to 3 variables. I won't bore your listeners with the absolute numeric equation.
Well, I'll put it in the, I was going to say, I'll put the paper in the show notes. So if we do have any listeners who really are keen on the stats, I know you go into it at length in the paper.
Absolutely. And of course you can, take the academic paper as well as the business one. So the simple version of that is essentially it came down to 3 variables. And I'll give you the the rough proportionality as well. So in ascending order of significance, and I'll give you the rough sort of relative quantum, as it were. The first one was, and it was a question I asked, if I'm honest, slightly accidentally, but as I was playing around and inserted it, realized it had it was playing a key role, was to what degree do you find your work intellectually stimulating? So that variable, and let's just call it IS now, intellectually stimulating, was a key. It was absolutely key in explaining E, and it probably in relative terms was about 1/6 of the explanatory force. So that's a really interesting area. The next one was this remaining variable that was in the starting model, which was, if you remember, why intrinsic motivation. So to what degree are you intrinsically motivated? And by its very definition, the firm you work in can't change that. It's just fundamentally who you are. Well, that is.
And motivation, this is probably a question some of my listeners are thinking. Motivation in what sense? So I'm intrinsically motivated is that I'm motivated to climb to make partner, I'm motivated to help the firm? Is there a...
No, in a far broader life affirming way. So I think the questions that came at that were just, essentially, to what degree can you self-motivate, be it in a pursuit of knowledge, in a pursuit of fitness, in a pursuit of career goals, pursuit of relationships? To what degree am I self-motivated? And again, what was really interesting, because I've had some challenge back when people have heard this as to, well, aren't you maybe you're just talking to a very motivated cohort, and they're all up that upper end anyway. No, again, when I analysed that data, it was almost a normal distribution curve as to where people were on the sort of self-motivation scale. There are many that would and I should say that the questionnaire was anonymous, and there was no reason why it should have had any sort of bias in that regard. And it proved that it didn't, in so much as there were scores of people that essentially self-volunteering themselves to be ones, twos. I'm struggling to get out of bed type folk. But some of those were actually in their contingent workplace highly motivated for other reasons that had sort of pulled them up, as it were. But yeah, so this variable was key. Why? And it had about 1/3 of the relative contribution. And there's some important implications of that for business leaders and employers as well. And then the final bit, and clearly, it was the hypothesis and reinforced my intuition, was this high-performing team piece. And, if you remember, I labeled that Z. That was absolutely key. And that was roughly 50% of the answer. Again, without boring the less technical reader, that was a quadratic equation, which means, it wasn't linear, i.e. actually you get the biggest gain at the early stages of that sort of Z score. If you take somebody from a poor team and put them in a pretty good team, you get massive amounts of contribution to the effort score. At the final sort of harder to reach sort of echelons of that, the gain in E is less. It marginally comes lesser, but fundamentally Z is absolutely critical.
And presumably and I think we'll come on to it with actually how you build that, but one of the other conclusions is that let's say you're inheriting a team. So I know you're passionate about helping entrepreneurs build their firms, but let's say you've joined a firm and you've inherited a practice area where there's a large amount of, or a lack of, internal motivation. Actually, building the high performance element can go some way to begin to outweigh that and make that transition. Is that a correct sort of inference?
I mean, totally. And back to this point of, by definition, you can only do so much. Well, you can do nothing actually with people's intrinsic motivation. It is what it is. But you can still take a relatively disparate group on that score and move it to a very collective overall high E score with just an absolute fixation on building a high-performing team. And I'll give you a really actually interesting side sort of story. I was in the States recently with a great organization. Actually, I'm sort of privileged to be part of the PI group, and we run a number of services, but one of the services is essentially development of high-performing teams. And I won't name the company other than say it was a brilliant group and very prestigious drinks brand, global drinks brand, but we were dealing with a North America team. Fantastic group of people, 30 of us, and 3 facilitators from the PI group. And we gave that questionnaire to every one of those of their team before they arrived. And we then got the average score. Essentially, we'll derive from the independent variables, i.e. asking them those questions. How intrinsically motivated are you? How intellectually stimulating is your work, and all of the components of that high-performing team score. And then we calculated what their average team-based E-score would be just on those derivative inputs. We then asked them separately what their motivation was and averaged that as well, and then revealed it on the first day of the event. And there was 0.1 decimal place difference between what our model hypothesized from the input and what actually they could tell us as the output. And just, how really fascinating is that you can genuinely, clearly it's statistics, you need a certain amount of data to sort of validate it. There's always going to be outliers, but at a certain level, and that was a team of 30, I can tell you how motivated that group are by asking them those 3 input questions.
Wow. And that was a big, because I think that's the other question that some of my listeners might have is, does this equation vary dependent on size of firm? Does it hold true for a firm of 50, but not so true for a firm of 500? It sounds like that was a bigger company you were working with there.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And there's a whole load of secondary studies that would be great to do off the back of this when I find some time. But in some ways, I think my starting hypothesis would be it doesn't vary massively with the size. Actually, what does change is the size of the firm means you're less likely to feel part of a high-performing team in a lot of instances, and therefore actually probably less motivated. So, as opposed to whether the size of the firm is corrupt in that model, I think the size of the firm would probably be corrupt the Z score, which is corrupt in the E score. That that'll be interesting to look at.
Yeah, and obviously the sort of Z score high performing teams came out as the number one for you, and that's where I think it'd be really interesting to come on to the next sort of evolution of, okay, if I buy this model and I've seen the research, I agree, that's the key area to go after. How do I do it? That's hopefully the question that my listeners have got, or people building their firms or building a practice area. I do also want to touch on for those in a practice area, but I think maybe we do that afterwards. How do I do it? Or how do I know where I'm even starting on that?
No, great question. And I think, if we've still got listeners with us, Nick, after that,
I think we're done for stats now, aren't we?
Tangent off into the stats world. I apologise to everybody. Then, that is clearly the hugely intelligent corollary kind of follow on. So the model I used, and I think massively validated with the results of this, was something we call the team to tribe model. And it has six layers to it, which are broadly hierarchical, i.e., to go into layer 2, you really need to have pretty solid layer 1. It's not completely linear. It's not like you can't do some of this in sequence, but broadly speaking, there's a hierarchical logic. So it kind of makes sense to step up on that model, because that's the nub of your question. So the layer 1, we call it the right stuff. And actually, when I first built this model, I called it talent, and then it sat with me for a while, and it didn't sit very comfortably because it's far more than talent. So the right stuff is definitely a better nomenclature. So what do we mean by that? Well, fundamentally, regardless of what team you're building, you need somebody who's technically proficient in what you do, or has the potential and aptitude to become very quickly technically proficient. So, back to the Royal Marines, and we're looking for people that can shoot their weapon over 300 meters pretty accurately, can run with heavy loads and get from A to B and then still shoot their weapon. You can strip that down into the component parts. Rugby team, you need somebody that can throw a ball accurately and You can break that down into a myriad of sub skills, sub talents, and professional services. Again, we've all built competency frameworks. You can look at the kind of analytical communication, personal traits that a good management consultant or good professional services agent has. So clearly, technical proficiency, but as importantly, attitudinally, they can do, and they have that proclivity to being a team player and a proclivity to a sort of a mental agility and sort of positivity. So, we call it simply can do technically, can do sort of attitude. And so the first layer is that there's as Jim Connors, wasn't it, said, fairly cliched, sort of getting people on the bus point. There's no point really talking about teamship until you've got that constituent membership in place. So fundamentally, and you go, especially so now, go back to this point that we know intrinsic motivation is such an important component of ultimately motivation. If you have the luxury of building a firm or team from scratch, then filtering people in is the most important thing you will do. And actually, one of the massively key things you're trying to filter in is just that intrinsic motivation. Really, really exploring that, because again, by definition, you can't change it.
I want to come back to the relative importance, but how do you do that? Because we've all been in interviews, and you sort of get asked about a time you failed, you get asked about a time you worked in a team. How do you, as a hiring manager or hiring business owner, actually push through what can sometimes be quite a contrived interview, or everyone's got their sort of best persona on?
I'm not going to claim to have the absolute sort of panacea to this, because it's a key challenge, isn't it? And it's got sort of nuances to it. So you're totally right. It's easily blagged as a sort of standard interview. So I guess what you're seeking to do is, I would say, really look beyond the sort of immediate professional world. I mean, I think you learn a lot more about people in terms of what they do outside of work and things they're proud of that's not necessarily in the professional space. So invariably what people have done outside of that is a really interesting lens into their motivation. So, but again, I think that's not necessarily a novel answer. Lots of people do that. I think, again, like a lot of actual traits that you're refereeing in, you need to sort of accept that there should be quite a lengthy probation period, because I think it is easy to be blagged actually in sort of short-term selection processes. So at the very least, there's a sort of a mitigation process of having 6 months, if you can extend it to that far, to sort of genuinely explore somebody's motivation. I would also say, from my own experience, we used to have lots of experiential events where people are coming together and mixing in sort of ways that kind of enabled that to be seen probably much faster than might have been the case in an ordinary sort of working life. Yeah, so no summary, simple answer, but exploring aspects outside of the working life, lengthy probation to sort of really validate it. People can't blag after a certain period of time, can they? And there's much of a different experiential mix in that working life to look at it as well.
I can't remember who the quote's from, but it's one of those, again, business cliches of you should judge people by how they treat the people they can't get anything from. So how they treat the receptionist or the secretaries as a way. I don't know if that's one you've come across.
Totally. And I think we might have even touched on it briefly, Nick. I totally agree with that. It's a slightly different point, though. I mean, for me, that was just basic human courtesies. And actually, I want to work with people who I just think are decent human beings, as opposed to motivation per se. But I think it's a brilliant test. Actually, I always used to run down and speak to our receptionist after an interview and just say, how did they treat you? Take somebody, senior hires, take them to lunch. Actually, I'm more interested in how they deal with the waiter than I am with me. So no, I totally endorse that also. I think it's a slightly different piece.
Sure. No, really, I think another interview tip for people listening. But to that point around, you've got the right stuff, and in terms of capability, but then in terms of sort of outlook and mindset, which is more important? If I've got, and we'll do the sort of polar opposites and you can find the grey in between. If I've got someone who's phenomenal at consulting, doing the do, but is a rubbish team player, and I've got someone who is average to, they meet the minimum, but they are your sort of minimum threshold in terms of capability, but they're a fantastic team player. Which one are you more likely to bring through the door? And feel free to make up as many people in the middle to sort of balance that.
Every day, Nick, the latter team player who could be starting off with that sort of minimum skill set, but I guess with the caveat that you can see the potential for that aptitude to grow. I mean, if you want to build a premium firm, you need people that've got more than minimum sort of technical proficiency. But every day, if you spot somebody with the right attitude, proclivity to being in a high performing team, super motivated, over the technical kind of A star. I mean, it's the classic Jack Welch kind of matrix point, this, isn't it? Where, if you remember the story, early days in GE, he very publicly sort of fired a number of his senior team who were the top sales folk in GE, but just in no way carried the values of their organization. And he famously got up on the stage. He said, "Look, I'm not sort of letting these guys go because they needed more time on the golf course with their families. Let's be really open about it. They didn't align with the values of this organization." It's so destructive when you get folk who are not playing that game, and actually super destructive when actually they've got the kind of card to wave of, "No, but I'm technically brilliant," because it makes it more challenging decisions, doesn't it, for the leaders to deal with. But every day, high attitude score, the ability to be technically proficient is absolutely where you want to look.
And it feels like, especially with the Jack Welch example, if someone's listening to this and actually they've been landed on and projects might be slightly different, but let's say they've been landed in a practice area and they've taken on a practice area. It sounds like the same is true there of assess what you've got in front of you, assess the people on the bus and quickly axe the ones who don't fit the team, have that internal motivation to be with the team, even if they are your best guy at whatever sort of capability it is you have.
Totally. And I guess with the benefit of a bit of time tracking, I can look back to a number of early junior colleagues at Moorhouse who were brilliant team players, brilliant individuals, so many positive traits, but weren't necessarily the most skilled consultant in early months. And actually, when you see that, what you kind of good firms hopefully do is say, like, we really need to coach and help the technical side of this, and there might be bespoke coaching. We certainly did that on a number of instances, and specific sort of training intervention. And I can't tell you how many of those individuals I can look back at now 10, 15 years on, and there's some of the best consultants you'd ever see. And they just didn't have the full toolbox early on, but they were absolutely brilliant grade A team players from the get go. That was the key determinant.
And so we've got the right people on the bus to start with. What if I'm listening to this and I feel I'm comfortable there? What's next in the model?
Yeah, so the next layer, Nick, is what we call clarity, and effectively you've got the right people now, but they need to know what to do. So it's the plan, it's the communication of the vision of the organization, where you're heading, right down to the silver thread that goes from that sort of corporate vision all the way down to what's the individual sort of activity that's gonna take me there. And again, for most organizations, that's broadly in place. I would say it's not unusual to have sight of some sort of coherent plan. And I think if you're early doors in this, then all I'm emphasizing here, and this will be no surprise, I've said it many times before, is if you haven't got that clear plan, and I think beyond plan, actually, sort of plan often gets sort of misinterpreted as a sort of just a statement of budget. And what I mean here is a strategy, really, a strategy that you can see the thinking behind strategic analysis that's gone all the way into the kind of the so what, and therefore what's the set of coherent actions we as an organization are going to take forward, and it's articulated and everybody can see that reference point. So yeah, make sure you've got that basic artifact in place and people are aware of it, it's communicated. So that's the next layer.
And I know it's worth saying, if you haven't listened to our last episode, I know you went into detail on planning and values. So I don't think we should revisit that, but do go listen to Dom's last interview because we cover that in depth there.
The next layer, Nick, would be empowerment, effectively. So again, you've got the right people, they know what to do. Allow them to do it, enable them to do it. And there's many organizations that have got actually fantastic team members, and actually, to be fair, have a reasonably coherent plan, but it's so stiflingly difficult to actually execute on it. It's either a large organization that's sort of got bureaucratically out of control, it's kind of unvisited governance and organizational structures, or actually you can have relatively small business where there's just a fairly autocratic founder who just won't pull him or her out of the detail and won't let people get on with it. So that there's an expression or more than an expression, there's sort of a philosophy almost in the forces called mission command, which is essentially empowering people. Everyone needs to know what the sort of intent is, and in the military we used to talk about 2 layers up from where you're working, where your operational level is. You understand exactly what the mission is and what's sort of aiming to be achieved, and you're placing it beyond the sort of de minimis kind of constraining parameters as required in the military context, just to be safe and not to wander into anybody else's area, and in a business perspective, just to mitigate commercial risk. But beyond the minimum of those parameters, let people get on with doing what you're asking them to do. Don't prescribe the how to them. Just provide clarity as to the outcomes sought, the context in which you seek it, and allow the talent and the creativity of your colleagues to sort of pull off the gap in between. And that's where you see huge step up in sort of team performance. So empowerment would be the layer.
How does anyone test that? I think like you said with some of the pieces when we spoke last time, at the time you were talking around sort of the balance between personal life and work life, and actually you made the point that when you're prior to it, it's very easy to see it as a risk, but once you're in it, it's very hard to see that balance, and you need other people to flag if that balance is being sort of eroded. Taking that metaphor and bringing it to here, if I am leading a firm, how can I test to see whether I might think that everyone's fully empowered, but how can I validate that? How can I make sure that actually, yes, the guys on the ground do feel they have the empowerment to do what they do successfully?
I mean, in some ways, it's a bit of a sort of glib answer, but I would frankly just ask folk, if you built the right kind of cultural firm where people are very comfortable speaking truth to the sort of leadership team, which is clearly prerequisite for this, then I think if you just ask folk that, you get the right answer. I think from a business leader's perspective, in some ways, it's invariably the case that you can do. And I'm pausing here because there's actually a bit of a nuance, because on one level, great firms, what they do is they codify and they standardize, and they have prescribed sort of checklists for aspects. We should unpack this maybe in a slightly slower time over another question. But on another hand, you are leaving huge amounts to in the moment creativity. And I think most leaders need to kind of expect more and kind of pull back from that latter part of this equation, and almost, as I say, just experiment, just give minimum sort of parameter to something. Again, as long as you're not Well, and you can also take measured risk. I mean, I'll give you an example. I think we touched on it in the last podcast, but when I ran a internal program to develop our internal sales capability, we decided very deliberately to let everybody have a go at that. And if they were so self motivated to do that, regardless of grade, and of course that came with risk because I had fairly junior colleagues and out in the marketplace talking to prospect clients and not really knowing what they were going to be saying. Another firm might have wanted to have totally supervised that. So of course, we knew that there would be a few trips and a few stumbles, but in terms of the net outcome, massive, massive sort of benefit in that instance, just to our sort of revenue growth. So I guess what I'm saying in a long-winded way is another way of discovering it is by incrementally pulling back, because it's invariably the case that you need to pull back as opposed to put more stricture in place. Because if you've genuinely put the right people on the team, that you've filtered people in who are by their nature seeking to fill those sort of those gaps and take on increasing autonomy.
That's quite an I think that's a really interesting point around as well, the layering. So if I think I've got the right people on, they're team players, they're great at what they do. How often or how do you have to revisit that as you evolve through this model? So did you maybe at Moorhouse or when you've seen this elsewhere found that as you've increased empowerment, some people, they might be great team players, they might have the technical skills, but actually they really floundered when they were given less direction or less restriction, I guess you'd say. I mean, how do you have to revisit each stage as you layer on top another level of the model?
So I would say you're constantly monitoring that. And to a degree, at a sort of macro level, there's a certain point, certainly from my experience, where you've coalesced around such a sort of set of traits and values and principles that it almost self-referees. So to a degree, whilst there's constant sort of maintenance and monitoring of that, it's almost a team-wide endeavor. So the leader per se doesn't necessarily need to be doing it all the time. You've built a construct that's sort of doing it by its very nature. But then, of course, I think where you're going as well is every individual is completely different, and there's completely contingent sort of variables for everybody. So you might have a junior person who just needs a lot of coaching. You talked earlier about some of those individuals, and what you're not therefore saying is, oh, you've not grasped this autonomy. You were given this ability to achieve this outcome, and you're not jumping into this sort of arena and executing. In those instances, that's where you have a master apprentice grade hierarchy to sort of mentor and coach people through. But I think once people then have build their technical inventory and they build their confidence, that personal autonomy bit is not something you need to ever be stifling. If you see that it's lacking, I think you're pulling people into that mindset.
Okay, so it's almost the coaching people to, if they're maybe less familiar with it from previous organizations, helping them understand and, like you say, coaching them through to be able to fulfill that element of their role. So we're now built, so we're now at that level 3 with empowerment. Well, I've got my teams going out, they're feeling confident I've given them the why, they're doing the how. What do I mean, that's an area that a lot of organizations don't get to alone, but let's say I'm there. What do I go next? How can I build on that further?
So next layer, and we're starting to probably get into the layers now, which are more challenging to articulate, and it's more ethereal in a way. But layer 4, we called alignment. So you've got the right people, they know what to do, they're enabled to do it. Layer 4 is they believe it's the right thing to do. And you now go into a completely different level of psychological contract engagement, in so much as genuinely the sort of stated values of an organization, a team, the purpose of that organization are totally aligned to personal values. And of course, therefore, that then takes you up a step in terms of your commitment to that. Referencing again the Royal Marines, there's a huge sense of honor working for an organization like that. Clearly, that is a collective of people that aren't there because of the pay package, I can tell you that for sure. But they're there for really very, very, very deep sort of principle-led reasons. Similarly, in the commercial world, there are businesses where you can much more align to. I give you actually a little side story. Acquaintance of mine I spoke to years ago, and he's a very capable guy, senior, executive, and very, very proficient guy. And I was sort of talking to him about motivation. I was, how would you describe your motivation? So, well, it's probably 7 out of 10. If I had to score, very proud guy, family to feed. There's some inherent motivators there. And I said, knowing probably the answer, I said, well, why are you not an 8 or a 9 or a 10 out of 10? And he works for British American Tobacco. So the answers to why he's not an 8 or 9 out of 10 is because fundamentally, that's a bit of a right field example to illustrate, because the purpose of that organization, it's difficult to throw yourself behind clearly, 100%. And a lot of people wouldn't even, I guess, want to work in that kind of organization. So the alignment to beyond the kind of rhetoric, beyond the espoused values, but the genuine values of an organization, if they coalesce with the personal values, the closer that becomes, that's essentially level 4.
And it is something I know we sort of spoke briefly about in the last interview, but I think worth touching on again in the context of building a high-performing team. And this model is the alignment, how the values to which you align evolve with the firm. So, you mentioned in the last interview that you, with Moorhouse, did an exercise where you went back and said, look, these are what Dom said. Do we still agree with that? Is that something that through empowerment happens naturally? Is that almost the transition point, the verification and where needed evolution of values from 3 to 4? Or is that just something that maybe worked for yourself and Moorhouse, but might not be the same for everyone?
I think my answer to that is, and again, we touched on it in the first podcast, that when you start out, typically just having a conversation with yourself, and I put down values that I knew were really important to me. And I guess, and I seem to remember you asked the question, Nick, that as soon as there was a sense of a team, that then made sense to check in on that conversation. And there was some sort of shaping, not radical. Clearly it's not going to be radical. It's more of a smoothing of the edges. And I think thereafter you want to do that pretty judiciously, because if they're genuinely deep values and principles, they sort of do stand the test of time. And it's certainly not an exercise you want to be sort of every quarter saying, right, guys, have we got the right values? I think there is a moment early on in a kind of team company formation where you check in on that. If you're making it the sort of the annual exercise and if the whole things get thrown out and reinvented, then you probably haven't sort of landed on the right set.
I'm just coming back to in my head the difference between the owner versus the practice lead. And I think the empowerment piece, you can build that empowerment. So you can build in your practice area or project team. We're touching on how there will probably be a lot of people listening to this who are maybe running projects, but not businesses or practices. Just as a sort of slight tangent, is this equally as applicable in, say, I'm taking on a delivery project of 50 to 100 people, or maybe 20, is this equally applicable there? Or is it worth sort of highlighting at this point that it's more focused on firm growth than it is, say, project delivery?
So I think the model's relevant everywhere. Because the brutal reality is it's probably more likely to be the case you've got a fait accompli. Here's your train set, try and steer it as best you can. All I would say is, if you take yourself through that model, there's many places where you can make a positive impact, regardless of whether it's fait accompli. But the brutal reality is the first layer, probably the most important layer, certainly on the hierarchical build, is whether that's the right group. And clearly, if you can't change constituent membership, you have got some massive constraints as to how great a team that's going to be. Notwithstanding, you've got the ability, if you can't change membership, to at least get more out of that group than would otherwise be the case, behaving in different ways. And even with the membership, no ability to change the membership at all, completely fettered in that regard, you can hugely signal, emphasize, provide the lead example of the behavioral tenets required, particularly around the right attitude, the can-do attitude, such that some people can adjust their behaviors. Again, you won't change the spots of the proverbial leopard, but you can shift some people that are sort of maybe in that malleable zone. And of course, you can improve the clarity of the plan. Of course, you can improve sort of layers of empowerment. And of course, you can enhance the sort of the values of that organization, which again will buoy up others. So yeah, it's not without its constraint, clearly by definition, but it doesn't mean the model's of no relevance.
And that I think is quite a key point, because I'm sure, and I've been in organizations like this, I'm sure you have, and on projects where, because maybe the right stuff isn't on the bus to start with, people sort of give up and not bother. But I think, as you've highlighted, it sounds like the people on the bus gives you the potential value, and it's up to you then utilizing some of these things we're talking about, some of the examples you just gave, to maximize that. So let's just say you might have a project team that can only ever get to a 6 out of 10 from an E perspective. but they could be at a 2 to start with. So getting them to a 6, you've trebled the motivation there. But if you've got your own people and your own team, you might be able to get the right stuff that give you a 10.
No, totally. I mean, and in some ways, again, particularly going again, technical warning. You remember it was a quadratic function, the sort of Z score as it contributed to E, but notwithstanding, and it's the classic sort of marginal 1% that we hear so much about, that even those small gains, and if it were, as I said, broadly speaking, Z's contributing 50% to that E, so let's just say 0 to 5. If you move a team from a 3.5 to a 4 in the commercial world, that can absolutely be the delta between you and sort of 60% of your competition. It's giving you that extra capacity to work on the business, as opposed to just in it the whole time, instead of just kind of and actually for professional services, this is really salient, because one of the really key distinguishing features is lots of firms are doing the best they can for their current set of clients. The firms that are growing and successful they're doing both that. They're doing that, delighting their current clients, whilst also finding the sort of marginal time to work on the business, growing capabilities, building new assets that take the firm to the next level. And they're doing that continuously as a concurrent activity. So you just eke out that little bit of extra motivation, and your Z score could be the component of it. That's the difference between a mediocre firm and one that's building capabilities to grow.
Really useful. And I think that point around the quadratic function, for those who are less stat savvy, and I'll frankly include myself in that, econometrics was something I haven't done for about 10 years, but that core point of, because of the shape of the function, a small amount at the early phase can actually have a bigger impact than later on. So doing a little will have a larger impact if you have a really unmotivated team than if you're trying to get the 1%ers and you're sort of the top of the top, the Royal Marines, the Olympians. It will have some impact, but it's a lot less and a lot harder to get. But right at the start, if you've got a basket case of a project, doing some of these things can have a huge impact relative to the effort involved.
Perfectly put, Nick.
Maybe I should go back to stats, Tom. Because I'm very conscious that those who are listening and those who have stuck with us through the stats and my bad fudge of summarizing stats probably want to know, okay, so they've got the alignments, done that element. And I guess one side point to that, how much does that play a part in the first phase? I know we've touched quite a bit for the last 10 minutes on getting the right stuff, but how much is that an evolution versus a check at the front door?
No, again, spot on question, in so much as, trying to emphasize these layers that sort of have some hierarchical build, but they're not completely, distinct. And that values alignment piece is clearly something you're both as an employer, as a firm refereeing, and I guess, as individuals are constantly refereeing when they make their career decisions. Yeah. And we touched on this again, didn't we, in the first podcast? I think the louder companies are with very proud values and principles, the better, because actually you're helping people decide whether it's the right organization for them fundamentally. And you want to think of it almost as much as putting people off who won't enjoy working in your firm as much as attracting people that do. So they're completely linked. You need to really project those values and principles very, very loudly.
So we're approaching tribe. We're at 4, so you're
getting close.
Yeah, I don't know if there's something in between team and tribe, but we're getting there. So what is it that takes a firm from your research and sort of your own experience? So maybe I've got there and I'm empowered. I think my team understand the values. They're aligned. How do I make that move from a bunch of people who work together to that tribe mentality?
So the final 2 layers, Nick, and let me probably talk to both at the same time, is what we've called, layer 5 is a sort of a centre of passion. Again, the team, they can do, they know what to do, they're allowed and able to do, they believe it's the right thing to do. Now they're at a point there where they would love to do. It's a genuine passion. It's a place where you count your colleagues as friends. The sort of the social world sort of bleeds into the working world. You genuinely look forward to going to work, and you call colleagues as very close people in your life. So I'll come back to how you create some of that or how you get there. But just to conclude this sort of model, the layer 6 is what we call togetherness. And this is a really difficult one to measure because it is almost an emotive state. And I think probably most people in their working lives would be lucky to get to this point probably more than 2 or 3 times at most. And it's a place where togetherness, I would say, at the very top, and this is the sort of the tribe definitely place, is where you have a sense, without arrogance or hubris, but a sense of, because of the collective brethren and the colleagues you share, that anything together is possible. And it, I say it's a kind of it's a difficult, deft thing to articulate in some ways, because it isn't arrogance. It's just this unbelievable sense of confidence that's not either ill-founded, that whatever it is, if I've got this sort of set of talent and this kind of collective team on my shoulders, we're going to achieve it. Again, I'm very fortunate, as we talked on before, if I go back to my sort of Royal Marines sort of endeavor, definitely that, times 10. And kind of, I think probably all of us individually would have a sense of, how did I find myself here with the talent that's on my shoulder? But if we're going to go over that hill, good luck with the other side of that hill, because I wouldn't want to face us type of attitude. With my own business, we used to joke, but I don't think it was totally ill-founded, that if you'd have taken us out of professional services or program management and dropped us into another kind of industry, give us 3-6 months to learn our way and find out the strategic sort of drivers of that industry, I think we would have pretty much got to be playing at the top quite quickly. It was that sense of Struth with this group of people. It's the world's proverbial oyster.
Did you ever dabble with trying something else? Was there ever
just started up a restaurant? No, we didn't. Actually, interesting. You interviewed Simon Dennis a while back, didn't you?
Yeah, I know Simon.
They've I think they've got a great team over there, and they're dabbling with an incubator, and I can understand why. In some
doing
ways.
some really good things with it as well.
Yeah, and again, I think it's a really interesting model, because I think particularly if your space is transformation, you know how to execute by dint of your professional service. Yeah, I know it sort of speaks to that kind of flavor. So in terms of what you do, I mean, again, this is really difficult stuff, because it's absolutely higher echelon. There's no simple answer. I think the sort of the passion layer, it's almost about an inner brand. It's almost, there's a set of stuff that's created, or the environment that just states this stuff, and stuff can be artifacts, stories, traditions, totems that essentially celebrate your inner brand. And it's done not because you frankly care if the outside world can see it. This is not brand building in the commercial, in the traditional sort of marketeering sense of the word. It's about an inner brand that you just as a collective celebrate and love.
Can you mentioned artifacts, totems. Can you give some examples, maybe from Moorhouse or elsewhere? What are those sort of things?
Yeah, I mean, again, and I'm sort of I pause, because what I don't want people to think is, if I also do this, we've jumped to layer 5. It's more the sort of the end artifact of a sort of emotional state in a way. But I mean, we had huge amounts of sort of crazy sort of items that I guess carried the brand. Everything from, we used to have baby mugs, so everyone in the office had a mug with us with our baby photos on, to Moorhouse pajamas, to Moorhouse calendars, to top trump cards, to So there was all of these crazy sort of just artifacts. I think more importantly would be just all the stories and traditions. I've talked about before, the annual wind up, or the quarterly escapes, or the first Wednesday of every month, Purple Wednesdays, with different events, and the band that would play at the Christmas party. It goes on, and it's not this list of stuff. It's the fact that you've created a place where people celebrate and enjoy and love the fact they're part of a community, and they're developing ongoing stuff that celebrates it and perpetuates it.
It's worth, and I think it is correct, but just to fact check, that those were things your team created. It's not that the Moorhouse marketing department decided we'd have Purple Wednesdays.
Yeah, totally. And in fact, actually, we had a small team, and it was almost a sort of, its remit was creative chaos in a way. It was like, just, you can facilitate this. We don't really we certainly don't want to prescribe it. I mean, just don't do anything that sort of damages our reputation if it ever gets out, but just have fun and keep that sort of inner brand alive. So there was almost a deliberate effort to kind of stimulate it, but the outputs were just completely serendipitous. And then the final layer, Nick, and you've heard me talk about this before, but you get there through essentially time-based, trust-bound collective sort of experience. And trust, actually, is worth saying. I think trust comes from people being fairly exposed on that journey. People have been stripped down, not in a deliberately negative way, but just because of, you've done such extreme stuff and you've been together so long that people have fallen over and tripped and stumbled and other people have picked them up. People have been exposed, and because there's not a huge culture of arrogance, people have revealed, where their weak areas are. It's essentially to get to that sort of high levels of trust. There's a degree of sort of some exposure has gone on some candid reveal has happened en route. Stories have been created. You've heard me often talk about stories, but in a corporate world, the more stories you have that you share, particularly ones that hopefully take you out of the fairly mundane, you get to a point where you just know that you're not going to be let down. And you also know that you've gone through many iterations of having a challenge put in front of you, not really knowing how you're going to deliver it. But again, the team kind of dynamic has constantly surprised and performed.
And something that you mentioned at the sort of the intro to that 5 and 6 piece, and I think something worth just asking you to get your take on, because one of the elements here is the extent to which I have to spend my entire life with the firm to create a high performing team. So you mentioned around social events, working hard, and there may be some people listening who thinks that means I've got to build a high-performing team. I've got to work late. I've got to be there the longest, and then I've got to go out and socialize with these people, and that almost make it my life. Where, in your view, is the right balance? There's a lot of firms I know who getting people out for an annual drinks is hard enough, versus the other end where some people work 20 hours a week 20 hours a day, and flat out. For those who are sort of listening to the point you made around building stories, where do people start, or how much is this a time for capability versus actually just doing some smart things will help lift you to that level?
Unfortunately, I don't think there's any sort of easy path to this, and it does take a degree of invested time beyond the 9 to 5. That said, this doesn't necessarily all need to be kind of late nights, and I've talked about quarterly escapes. I think that's an investment that a lot of firms can make, even if it's not quarterly, frankly. I think a number of businesses, if they just took their teams away, once or twice a year and just had a committed 2 or 3 days, that they've sort of carefully architected, put some consideration into, that's a combination of work and social and just some different activity. It's just caring about the kind of working world beyond the sort of 9 to 5, beyond the kind of standard serving the clients in a professional services space. If you genuinely want to build a company, a construct, a team, there is a deliberate focus that's required on that aspect. It's just not going to happen by osmosis, just doing the standard job.
And I think that's the point I was trying to find out, like you say, is you've highlighted escapes. I mean, I know from the places I've worked, not scientifically, but the places where people socialize together, albeit once a month, there is a much better bond than between the places where people don't. And the same, you mentioned around the totems. You get some firms where the marketing department does have pens. I'm holding one from a hotel chain at the moment, but every consultancy has pens, books, etc. But it's the organic evolution. It's almost the why you're doing it, not the how or the what you've done, is the sense I'm getting from you around that level 5 and 6 to really get up there.
Totally, yeah. And again, it's sort of worth pointing out that clearly the artifacts are not the input, and they're the sort of evidential output. That's something that's interesting. So and it's certainly not on marketing output. But I mentioned one earlier, like the trump cards. I mean, that came about because a couple of the guys in the team just thought it would be genuinely amusing when the team's roughly 50 strong, a pack of cards to celebrate everybody's quirkiness. And so, everybody's scored on different aspects. I think they were looky-likey as well. So everyone's got a looky-likey. And
do you remember who yours was?
Do you know, I think, who was it? It was Arthur Daly. I'm embarrassed to admit. Apparently, I look a little bit like Arthur Daly. I hope that was about looks anyway, not my business stuff. So, but what it was doing was celebrating that, this team is so close. We know everybody's sort of little quirks so well. We just want to sort of laugh about them and celebrate them. And the artifact that came out, a pack of trump cards, was just sort of almost a side piece. It was the fact that the team had got to that point where they genuinely enjoyed and had that sort of level of humor,
One thing across all of the model, and I think you've given really clear direction at each stage of how you can build this as a CEO, let's say, or as someone running a firm. There's almost an implicit element of you as the founder or leading team driving this. And some of my listeners might be listening and thinking, well, that's great if you're an extrovert, you're outgoing, you love going to these parties, to these escapes, to these drinks. How is this different, if at all, if you're more of an introverted person? Do you obviously advise firms who are sort of in a similar place to where Moorhouse was? What do you find yourself saying to those leaders who are maybe, Dom, I'm just a bit of a quieter guy or a girl. That's not going to these big drinks. That's not me.
I would say it's got nothing to do with sort of extrovert, sort of gregarious sort of natures. You're right to sort of identify that as being almost a sort of a common inference that's made. But you mentioned the word, I think, charismatic there. And for me, charisma is not about that sort of extrovert jumping up on the tables. It's much more about the sort of the very confident carrier of values who genuinely lives those values. And I think that authenticity in leadership is what is charismatic, and that's what carries people. So that doesn't need you to be the life and soul of the party. It does need you, however, to be vocal about what you stand for, where you think the firm's going, the clarity bit, making sure people are clear about the sort of values and principles in the organization, and sort of engendering that sort of inner brand that I talked about. So none of that is extrovert. It's authentic, I think, is probably the word I'm trying to emphasize.
Brilliant. And thank you. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that, because I'm sure there are people listening and I think that will be really useful for them. So I'm conscious of time, Dom, and I know there is a second half to this, which is listener questions. So I think we've gone into some real detail on the paper. I'll include the paper that you wrote around the team to tribe model in the show notes so people can go and read it. Both I've seen the business version. If there is the academic version with the heavier stats section, I'll include that as well for those who are more that way inclined. But I think it's worth just pausing it. For those listening, what would your sort of closing bit of advice be on this team to tribe model? If someone's listened to this and thinking, right, I need to self-audit and then move my team up that quadratic function, what would you say to them?
I guess to the degree with a sort of copywriting flourish, I titled the paper "The Most Important Equation a Business Leader Need Ever Know," but hopefully it's come across in this podcast, Nick, is I kind of mean it. So my sort of final piece on this would be, what's the so what's we've talked about. You can't change people's intrinsic motivation, but know how significant it is. And therefore, selection processes that filter for it, you really, really need to explore that, maybe have another look at that in your own team organization. And hopefully, with some emphasis, I've illustrated why the high-performing team bit is really at the nub of all of this. And I would just say, just become equally intellectually fascinated by the topic of team. I mean, mine is one but paper. There's a lot of interesting stuff out there. Just take a professional passion in working out what makes high-performing teams tick. And that's the bit where you just need to stay completely focused on.
Last episode, you gave some really good book recommendations. If anyone is interested, like you said, about reading more around this topic, you've highlighted how important it is. Are there any other books, obviously, on top of your paper that you'd suggest people check out?
So in danger of drowning you under a long, long list here, Nick, because as you probably imagine, I get fairly consumed on this topic, but I'm just going to call out 3 books that have sort of jumped out at me and are sort of beyond the normal sort of, I guess, fairly easy sort of platitudinal read. But The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team is a bit of a modern classic. Patrick Lencioni, I just think he writes it in a very very sort of easy to read style. I think that's a nice read and very reinforcing, hopefully, of a lot of what I've talked about. And I'm going to call out another book, which actually I would put a little kind of reader warning on it. This is quite an academic book. I mean, very academic book in a way, but this is a guy who is seriously deep in the topic of what teamship's all about. It's called Authentic Leadership by a guy called Robert Terry. Courage in Action, Authentic Leadership, Courage in Action, Robert Terry, which is a difficult read, but by some margin, probably the most considered book I've ever read on the topic. And then another one, which I think is just a classic and stood the test of time, is General Slim, Courage, which again, I think it's captures a number of radio speeches and radio interviews he gave. But it's a really, really interesting book, particularly if you like your military history.
Brilliant. Well, thanks a lot for those recommendations, Dom. And I'll include those in the show notes. Hopefully they're all still in print. So I'll see what I can find on Amazon, and I hope my listeners find those useful. So we spent a huge amount of time and some really good insights around the team to tribe model. As you know, and as my listeners hopefully know, you were kind enough to to let me test out a new show idea, and that is Ask Dom Anything, or Ask My Guest Anything.
That's not the show idea.
This won't become a new podcast just with Dom. He may create his own, but you never know. And so thank you to all of those who submitted questions. There's 4 that jumped out, and it'd be really interesting to get your answers too. Feel free to take them how you want. Give us an in-depth answer, give us a short one. Say, actually, I don't want to answer that, whatever it may be. And I'm going to really read them as I got them with just slight changes to make more sense in asking you. So the first one is, you've obviously given a lot of advice in this episode and the last one. If you could go back and give your 30-year-old self just one piece of advice, what would that be?
Struth. I would say I would reinforce the point, again, I touched on in our first chat, Nick, of the importance of viewing success, life in a much broader perspective than just the career, professional services lens we're looking at this through now. Because, again, as I touched on, really success in this dimension is for absolute naught, if you've let a whole load of other bits and pieces go. So I guess, it's not that I wouldn't have known that as a 30-year-old, but I think setting out at that point where, you're ready to throw yourself into the lion's den, and, it's kind of, you're in the zone then, aren't you, paying your mortgage, young children, life's pretty crazy, that, it wasn't that I was lacking any motivation or appetite for that challenge. And I think, if anything, it's sort of people need a little bit saving from themselves. So I think, as you know, I was fortunate and probably just about saved myself from myself, but it was only because, some good friends and good counsel on my shoulders. So I think I probably just sort of reinforced that message. But you know what? I actually also think my 30-year-old self has probably got a lot to teach my near 50-year-old self in a way. I think we always presume that, with age comes wisdom, and it's a sort of one-way street, that. But actually, I almost think asymmetrically, I'd rather listen to my 30-year-old self and say, what would he be telling me now? And
Okay.
I think what he would be saying is, remember that whole bit about, whoever has the most stories wins, and just making keeping life's rich adventure ticking over. And yeah, I think that's an interesting another way of looking at it. Maybe as a side note, we should write letters to ourselves in 10 years' time. And if I were to do that, I think I would be saying, 60-year-old Dom, are you still out there doing trips and adventures? And if not, why not? I want to hear why.
No, and I think that's a really interesting take. Like you say, what can you take from your younger self when life's changed in 10 years' time, and you may have forgotten some of those things that helped drive you when you were younger? So thank you very much for that. One of my listeners listened to the TED Talk, they've listened to our interview, and they've highlighted that something you're obviously passionate about and see as a core part of your success is planning and written plans, writing down what you want to achieve and to an extent when you want to achieve it. And the question really is about how you balance that. So at what point do you find that a written plan becomes overly rigid or prescriptive? And how do you leave room for that creativity and spontaneity as part of life?
This is a sort of common, I guess, sort of mildly veiled critique of plans. And I understand it, completely understand it. And I hear it a lot in the context of business planning, but I guess also here we're talking about it in the context of personal planning as well. And I think, again, I'm going to emphasize that, when I talk about plans, what I'm talking about is not just some fairly flat, one-dimensional, in a business context might be, P&L budget, for example. I'll often speak to firms and say, have you got a plan? And and then point to an Excel spreadsheet. What I talk about here is it's more about the sort of strategic analysis that's gone on in the background. So again, regardless of whether you're talking about building out a company or whether you're talking about your own personal kind of career and life plan, fundamentally, some level of situational analysis where you've sat down and thought about what's going on in the world at the moment. What are the drivers? Where's the sort of the opportunities and the challenges out there? And then you've kind of gone into a level of diagnosis beyond that to say, well, if that is the case, and with my set of talents and capabilities or corporate assets, what is our approach that sort of makes sense of that and actually takes us off on an approach that takes us closer to our stated outcome? And a plan, therefore, when you write it, and I think there is real value in writing it down, is not the fact that you've got this document at the end with all the words on it. It's the fact that you've deliberately taken yourselves through those precursor thoughts. And it's the thinking that is the key bit. The plan is just evidence that you've done that and you've brought it all together in a coherent artifact. So for me, and it's a good question, I'm not seeking to demean the question, but it's actually, once you've done that thinking, actually you've got the tram lines on which amazing adventures and creativity and spontaneity can sort of take place. But doesn't in any way stifle that. It just means that it's within the context of some outcomes that you've intelligently thought about and within a strategy that you've given some due consideration to.
And the word you use there, the tram lines, it feels like that's actually quite an important nuance to highlight. So tell me if you agree or tell me if I've got this completely wrong. But what you're saying in terms of planning is obviously the thought element first. And, one of the memorable quotes from our last podcast was people spend more time planning their holidays than they do their lives. So that's, you're already ahead of most. It feels from that point around tramlines that when you talk about planning, you're not talking about this day I'm going to day by day planning or week by week planning. It's more a holistic, okay, in a year's time, I want to have had a story, I want to have had an adventure, and life, those are the tram lines you set and life follows down those, as opposed to, I'm not going to go and do that because my plan is to do something else today. Is that right?
No, totally. And in some ways, I mean, let's just take a sort of fairly trite example, but you might say in the broader sense, I know I want to create some adventures, and therefore I need to take myself off on 1 or 2 trips a year. If you've put some kind of dimension to it, it's more likely to sort of therefore happen. You may have no idea what that is, but at least then when you're down the pub and you're having that conversation or in the coffee shop, and somebody throws a sort of a crazy idea at you. Do you know what? I said I was going to keep myself honest to 1 or 2 trips a year, and why not 2 weeks in Mongolia, cycling across the salt plains or whatever it is you're up to next year. But you've put some sort of construct to the relevant context of that serendipity and creativity.
Yeah, no, really good point. And yeah, I am looking to cycle across. It's a frozen lake in Mongolia. So if anyone fancies that next March, drop me an email and we can have a chat. So last 2 questions. And this one is a bit more business focused. And it's about specializing and being a specialist versus a generalist. So working within a larger firm, and I'm reading this verbatim as close as possible, working within a larger firm, you often specialize in one area. So you might be a project manager, an accountant, a marketing executive. Whereas often working in an entrepreneurial environment, you might do all of these roles. Like you said, when you've started Moorhouse, it was you, and you did HR, you did BD, you did delivery. When building your own firm within the remits it allows, would you recommend trying to stay specialist and thereby allowing you to perfect and hone your craft? So let's say consulting, delivery, or should you be happy to and almost embrace working across a number of areas and going for a breadth of experience and becoming more of a generalist?
I'm going to slightly dodge your question and say it's a bit of both. I mean, the classic sort of, I think it was McKinsey sort of phrase, isn't it? The T-shaped consultant summarizes it. So the T-shaped consultant being the vertical bar being the specialism and the horizontal bar being the generalism. I think that's almost at the nub of what you need to have to build your own firm. So in some ways, though, I guess akin to many entrepreneurs, I'm a bit of a generalist, and actually intellectually get very very itchy and seek to sort of move my brain onto different topics. I don't like to sort of linger. So I'm inherently sort of, I guess, generalist in that regard. And I loved actually some of the challenges of the early stage company build, because it was taking me into many new areas. In some ways, actually, we started the podcast talking about method grid. I'm entrepreneuring in a completely new digital sort of tech space. And, frankly, there's a lot I don't know. And I just find that fascinating. So yes, I think you absolutely need to be a generalist, but hold on to a specialism. It needn't be all of the specialisms of the firm you've built. It probably will be one of the central ones, or certainly one of the early ones. So you don't need to sort of necessarily therefore specialize in every incremental build on the capability set that's kind of developing. But fundamentally, you're building a professional service firm, you've also got to be the surveyor of quality and set that sort of exemplar quality assurance standard. So that's got to stand in one area. But beyond that, I think you very quickly, but very quickly do need to become a generalist. And actually, it's becoming a generalist, building the horizontal bit of the T, which, is the really fun bit.
Brilliant. Well, thanks. So an answer both to an extent, and I'll include, I'm sure I can find online the McKinsey T-shaped consultant model, because I like the analogy. It's not one I'd actually heard before, but I'm sure I think it's really useful. So thank you. And then very last question, and this is one that we're both Tim Ferriss fans, and we hear him, he asks every one of his guests. So it'll be interesting to hear how yours, you can probably already guess, but it'll be interesting to hear how yours varies from that, is morning routines. And do you have any specific morning routines? And if so, what are they?
I guess I do. I mean, I'll sort of describe this morning's routine, I guess, and that's it's fairly established, I would say, as a weekday routine. If I'm honest, I tend to sort of put away from it of a weekend, because I'm also really interested in what people do, Nick. And I think actually I found myself speaking to a lot of people about sort of morning habits, particularly. It is interesting. So this will be my morning. Sort of wake about 6:45. I'm going to be pedantic here. Clean the teeth, wakes me up. Grab a pint of water. Actually, I wrote a podcast, and maybe I'll point your notes to it, which talks about some of this. Yeah, grab a pint of water, and then I come to my desk and I do a couple of things. I guess I do a few things in sort of 10, 15-minute blocks. So block one would be a really sort of simple journal of, I use something called Day One, which is a really simple journaling app. And I do a quick sort of, what is it I'm seeking to achieve today? What are the 2 or 3 outcomes? If I just do those, nothing else, has been a successful day, a bit of a reflection, maybe on the day before, but, really high level sort of journaling. And I do that in conjunction with something called, I use another app called Things, which is from the Getting Things Done Michael Allen book, I think I mentioned. So that's kind of essentially, I look at my calendar, what's in my Things app, and using Day One journal, I sort of bring it all together and, as I say, summarize what's the key outcomes for the day and what's in my today set in my Things app. So that's one 15-minute block. I grab 15 minutes to read a book, and you can see my bookshelf here. It's not going away anytime soon. And the only way I can slowly move through it is just literally chipping away 10, 15 minutes each morning. And I think, what I find is 10, 15 minutes equals 10, 15 pages. And slowly but surely, I sort of grind my way through that bookshelf.
Just on that point, so we're sitting in Dom's office, and you've got a huge amount of books on that shelf. Do you start at one end, read the whole of that book, go on to the next one? Do you dip in and out of books?
No, I definitely, with that habit, I definitely have an order. But each time I get to the end of the book, I'll survey the burgeoning bookshelf. And I, as I said, Nick, I'm a sucker. If anybody recommends a book to me, if I hear a sort of recommendation 2 or 3 times, I sort of quickly jump to Amazon and buy it. So there's a number of books here I'm keen to read, but every time I finish one, I'll sort of recalibrate which one is it I want to read next, because quite often just something's come up in life, or recent conversation, or you're working on a particular project that moves that order around. Yeah. So, but once I've started a book, I'm pretty good at grinding my way through that one, and then I will grab 10, 15 minutes, and again, I think I may have mentioned podcast one, sort of an app called Headspace, which is like a silence the brain for 15 minutes, because I think, like a lot of people, I have a really busy head full of to-dos, and whilst I've got some of it out and it sort of lives in my Things app, just teaching myself to silence the brain for 50 minutes is I find, and I've only done this in latter year, and only because I've spoken to so many people who've really advocated it. It didn't really come naturally to me, I guess, at first, but it's a really important part of my working day now. And then, from that, I'm pretty fired up, shower, breakfast, and at the desk. But if I do that, and I'll do that sort of most working days, unless I'm off somewhere early doors, and it really feels like the day's well set up.
Brilliant. And you mentioned you picked bits up off. You asked this question to a lot of people. Meditation's one bit. Did the other 2 bits, were those things that you'd heard 2 or 3 people say, "Oh, great"? So you built them in, or were those organic things you tried? How did you form that routine?
I think just a combination of reading articles, podcasts, chatting to many sort of folk I admire, and I've definitely sort of played around a bit with it. I used to, if I'm honest, I used to try and also get a morning stretch in, and what I find now though is I'm so raring to go once I've done that set. I'm too fidgety when I'm sort of trying to do a stretch as well. I wish I could do it more often. It'd be a great habit to keep in there. So that's kind of, but in some ways, been ejected for not enough time in the day. So I think it's important, isn't it, to play around with it and work out what works for yourself. But having a routine, almost regardless of what's in it. I mean, recognizing hopefully you put some constructive habit in there is definitely to be encouraged.
Right, brilliant. And it's a question I want to and need to ask more, but I find myself timing out too often. But the other guest, so I asked Adrian Betteridge, who's the managing partner of Bringer and formerly my boss, and he also, interesting to hear the similarities. So he also had the journaling, he also had the meditation. So Dom, thank you very much for this. It's been great to catch up for round 2. Thank you for sharing your insights on Team to Tribe, and I'll put that out on the show notes. Thank you also for answering listener questions and giving back some insight into some other areas that we didn't get to touch on last time, because we spoke about a whole raft of things, but as always, there's things that you just can't do because we don't have 10 hours. And people already tell me that this podcast should be shorter. I don't believe them, but
it's true. But I haven't helped you with that one.
So Dom, all that's left to say is thank you very much and all the best for the rest of your week.
Thank you, Nick. It's been a pleasure as always.
Brilliant. Cheers, Dom. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Climb in Consulting podcast. If you did, I would be very grateful if you could leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcast platform of choice, whichever one you may be using. And please also share this with anyone that you think could benefit from hearing today's interview. If you want to get in touch or give me any feedback about the podcast, please feel free to drop me an email. It's nick@climbinconsulting.com, and I look forward to hearing from you.